Okay, hello and welcome to our webinar today. We will be talking about humidity parameters and choosing the right one for humidity control in HVAC today. And my name is Lars Stormbom. I'm a product manager at Vaisala. I've been working with humidity measurement and sensor development and R&D for more than 30 years now. And just a short slide about Vaisala before we start with the actual presentation. So we serve customers in both weather and controlled environment markets. We have actually existed for more than 80 years and provide now a comprehensive range of different observation and measurement products and services. And as regarding the humidity measurement, Vaisala was actually the first company to commercially introduce thin film humidity sensors, the HumiCap specifically, and that was more than 40 years ago. And since then we have obviously also continued developing the sensor. So we believe that we are still state-of-the-art in this field. But let's continue to today's topic. And today we will go through some of the basics of different humidity parameters and how choosing the correct one might influence your HVAC system. And specifically 4 parameters: relative humidity, dew point, enthalpy, and wet bulb temperature. And by the way, all questions you should direct to the chat line, and we will try to answer questions at the end of the session. If we don't have the time to answer all of those, don't worry. We will send email answers to those that we couldn't address during the call. So now on to the actual content, and let's start with relative humidity. So relative humidity, that's actually defined relative to the maximum value or the saturation vapor pressure, which depends on temperature. So that's why it's called relative. And this relative value is calculated then according to the or relative to the saturation vapor pressure, and you can see this graph here, which shows the saturation value as a function of temperature. And you can see this is a very nice exponential curve. And what this curve tells you is actually the maximum amount of water that air can hold at a certain temperature. So what does that mean for relative humidity? So, okay, here in this slide you see the actual definition of relative humidity. So it's the actual vapor pressure divided by the saturation value. So that would be the graph here. So relative humidity actually means the proportion of actual water vapor pressure to the maximum value, which is given by this curve here. So these glasses here try to illustrate that the relative humidity value can be the same, but the actual amount of water depends a lot on the actual ambient temperature. And let's go on to a couple of examples here, what this actually means. So, okay, let's assume first that we have a vapor pressure of 100 hectopascals is the unit here. So that would be the vertical blue line here, shows the actual value. So now, if the ambient temperature is 100, that means we are reading the saturation value here at 1013. And now we do the math and end up with a relative humidity of 10%. Now, if we cool down this same gas and have the same amount of water in there to 60 degrees, that means the saturation value drops from 1000 down to 200. So now the relative humidity value is actually 50%. And if we go a little bit further down the temperature range, down to about 46 degrees, that means the curve here is actually hitting 100. And that means now we have reached saturation conditions. And the air can actually not hold more water than this. If you try to go further, you will get condensation. Now, relative humidity then, to get back to our heading of today as a control parameter, what does that do for you? Well, and relative humidity is directly related to human comfort. Also, other biological processes are usually governed by the actual relative humidity value. What it does for you is allow changing the temperature without changing the relative humidity. So that means you can increase or decrease temperature depending on the preferences of the people, but still keep your humidity controls unchanged. Well, drawback is in some cases, especially if you want to have a very tight control of the humidity and the temperature at the same time, you might get controls fighting each other, because changing the humidity level typically also influences the temperature, and certainly changing the temperature will change the relative humidity value, as you saw in the examples before. So let's go further now and see an example of what might actually happen. So let's say that we have a lab or a clean room, for instance, and we want to maintain a very tight control here around 20 degrees centigrade and 50% relative humidity. And the graph here shows what the temperature control is actually doing over time. So, okay, you might think this the controls designer or engineer hasn't done a very good job, because we're seeing a quite large oscillation. But that might be the case, yes. But let's see how that influences actually the relative humidity. So in the next graph, you see here that this is actually the same temperature oscillation we saw in the last graph. But just because the temperature is changing, you are actually causing a relative humidity change also. So when the temperature goes up, that means relative humidity goes down. And okay, just this temperature oscillation here is driving, let's say, about 3% RH plus minus deviation around the set point of 3%. So we haven't actually changed the amount of water at all. This is all caused just by the temperature fluctuation due to the temperature control in the room. Now, as you were trying to achieve a pretty tight control of your conditions, you might have decided, I want to control relative humidity with an plus or minus 2% RH, which means you have a kind of neutral band here from 48 to 52%. But then if you have a very simple on-off control here for in this case, so that means once your sensor starts overshooting 52%, that means you're actually starting to dry the air, or when the sensors are dipping below 48% RH, you're starting humidification. And that in itself will also probably drive temperature changes. So in this, that exact amount would depend on the type of drying or humidifying equipment you're using. But probably you will increase temperature when you're trying to add humidity, or decrease temperature when you're starting to dry. So what you're actually doing with your humidity control, you're making the temperature oscillations actually even larger. And here's an idea of what the actual result might look like. So by trying to control very tightly, using relative humidity and temperature as control parameters, you're actually causing a lot of havoc in the HVAC system. You're trying to cool and heat and humidify and dry almost all the time. Right. So how can you fix this situation? Well, to do that, you need to actually choose another control parameter. That would be, in this case, dew point. And let's see what that's all about. Well, as you heard at the beginning of the presentation, there is a maximum or saturation amount that air can hold at which varies according to the ambient temperature, so that hot air can hold a lot more water than cold air. And the dew point actually tells you which temperature you will start to get condensation at. So it's another way to state how much water you actually have in the air. So for any amount of water, once you start to cool it down, sooner or later you will hit a certain temperature where the air is saturated and you will start to get condensation. The good thing about this parameter is that it's actually independent of the ambient temperature, unlike relative humidity. So as a control parameter, if you're trying to do a very tight simultaneous control of both humidity and temperature, dew point control is actually a pretty good idea. Well, drawback is it doesn't really tell you anything directly, at least, about how human comfort or biological processes are affected by the humidity. So you'll have to convert to relative humidity to get an idea. So let's go back to our previous example then. So, okay, we have our clean room here. We want to hit 20 degrees centigrade and 50% RH. And we're not perfect with the temperature. We're still having exactly the same fluctuation here. But now I've converted the relative humidity value to a dew point value that converts to a little bit more than 9.2 degrees centigrade in dew point terms. And actually, now, if you're not adding or removing any water, the dew point doesn't actually change at all, even though the temperature is going up and down. And that means if you convert your desired control band of plus minus 2% RH to dew point terms, this means you're controlling to plus or minus 0.6 degrees centigrade. And this corresponds to your 2% RH control band. So this is now your control band, and if there are no water sources or sinks in your system, the controls are perfectly happy, and they're not trying to add or remove water just because the temperature is fluctuating a bit. So this means that the dew point is actually a very good choice and quite popular in applications where you want to have very tight control of both parameters. So that would be, let's say, dew point laboratories, clean rooms, perhaps a museum. So in that case, dew point is a very good choice. Okay. We have also a couple of other parameters here that are frequently used for humidity control in HVAC systems. So one of those is wet bulb temperature. This is already a little bit more specialized. So what is actually then wet bulb temperature? Well, wet bulb temperature actually tells you to what temperature a water surface could be cooled down by evaporation. So if you imagine you have a water surface, water is going to evaporate from that. That will consume heat. But on the other hand, once your water is cooling down, you also will release heat by the cooling down of the actual air. So once you have this system running for a while and you reach an equilibrium, and you can then measure what the temperature is of this water, and that is your wet bulb temperature. Okay, so how much will of cooling will you actually get? Well, that depends on the amount of water in the air. If there is no water whatsoever, you will have a lot of evaporation and you will get a lot of cooling. If the air is already saturated, that means there will be no evaporation from the water surface and also no cooling down. And that means your wet bulb temperature is exactly the same as the ambient temperature. So again, wet bulb temperature indicates to which temperature you can get water to cool down by evaporation. Depends on the ambient temperature and it depends on the humidity. Very high humidity means you won't get very much cooling. Very dry conditions, you will get a lot of cooling due to this evaporation. So how is this then actually used? Main way to use this parameter in HVAC systems is to indicate evaporative cooling potential, and that's in practice used together to control cooling towers. It's pretty much directly related to air energy content, so that's another way to use it. But again, doesn't really indicate anything about human comfort or biological processes like mold growth. Okay, so here's a practical view how it looks like. This is now a cooling tower. What are you then using these cooling towers for? Well, you're actually trying to achieve free cooling by having water evaporating. So you have a closed system with cooling fluid, and you're trying to cool that down. Then you have water that's streaming down on these cooling coils, and you have ambient air and some fans blowing this past these cooling coils and the water, so that water is evaporated. So in this way you're getting a cooling effect, and then the heat is actually dumped into the ambient. And you can then get in some cases, depending on the ambient conditions, quite a significant, in practice, almost free cooling without running any compressors or such. And in the picture you can see an example of how a sizable set of cooling towers might look like in practice. So now, how does the wet bulb temperature then affect your controls? Well, okay, you have the cooling water you are trying, or cooling fluid that you are trying to cool down, comes in at a certain temperature. The wet bulb temperature will tell you the theoretical minimum temperature that you might get out. But in practice, these cooling towers are not 100% effective, so there's a temperature differential that you will leave there, so the cooling water will actually come out a little bit higher than the wet bulb temperature, and this is called the approach. So usually these are set to run 2 to 3 degrees above the wet bulb temperature. So trying to get lower, that means you are consuming a lot of water for the evaporation, and your fans are running, and you're using quite a lot of energy on that. So practical set point is usually a couple of degrees above the wet bulb temperature, if you have the right dimensioning on your cooling towers, obviously. Okay. So by using the wet bulb temperature, you can see then directly if it makes sense to run your cooling towers today, or if it's very humid day today, you might not actually achieve any cooling to speak of, in which case you need to use other means of cooling your building. Right. Another slightly related parameter, the final one actually, is the enthalpy. And okay, it's a scary looking graph. Let's see a little bit more about that later, what it can tell us, and maybe a little bit more practical ways than using these kinds of psychrometric charts, the traditional way. So what's actually enthalpy? It's a measure of the energy content in the humid air. And it's usually actually measured relative to a reference state. So how much energy do I need to expend in order to get from this reference state to the current condition? Well, this is usually dry air at 0 degrees centigrade, or if you are using non-SI units like British thermal units per pound, the reference state is usually selected to be 0 degrees Fahrenheit, but dry in any case. And the units for these are then kilojoules per kilogram in SI units or British thermal units per pound. And this actually takes into account both the energy you need for the sensible heat, or heating changing the temperature from the reference state, and also how much energy you need to expend to adjust the humidity. And actually, the amount of humidity will usually be the dominant factor in there. So evaporating or condensing water, that takes a lot of energy. Heating up a little bit, that's not nearly as much. So how do you then use enthalpy as a control parameter, and where would that fit in your HVAC controls? So what it tells you, and the normal use for this is actually that it tells you directly if it makes sense to recondition return air or not. And again, doesn't really tell you anything about human comfort or effects of biological processes, but it's something more useful for as an internal measure in an HVAC system. So here's an example then. Let's assume you have a return air duct and a humidity and temperature sensor sitting in there. You can either recondition returned air, change the temperature and the humidity, or you can choose to use outdoor air and condition that to your desired condition. Obviously, you will need to have some amount of outdoor air eventually, because otherwise your carbon dioxide will build up. But let's, for simplicity, disregard this now. Well, the enthalpy control in this case then means you're measuring the enthalpy of the return air and comparing that to the outdoor air. And we have the scary looking graph coming up now. Be warned. So here are then a couple of actual conditions. So let's assume you are measuring return air temperature, 76 degrees Fahrenheit or 24.4 in centigrade at 50% RH. And this graph is in BTUs per pound, and that converts to 28.7. So this is actually the point number 1 here in the graph. The enthalpy scale here is this one. It's kind of diagonal here. And ambient temperature is here at the bottom of the graph, and then the humidity is then the y-axis here, so increasing, going up. Now, okay, you have an outdoor air. In this example, it's a little bit colder, 72 degrees or 22 degrees centigrade, but it's actually high humidity outside. It's 90%. And that means even though the temperature moved down a bit, the humidity increased so much that your enthalpy has actually increased from the indoor air condition. And it's now 33, almost 34 BTU per pound. So if you're actually trying to cool down, this means that it doesn't make sense to introduce outside air to cool down the building, even though the temperature is lower than inside, because there's so much of humidity you need to remove to reach the 50% RH. So enthalpy outside is actually higher than inside, even though temperature is lower. So this is the point number 2 here. Okay, another example, which is the point number 3 here. So now you're trying to achieve the same condition inside, and now it's actually pretty hot outside. It's 85 degrees Fahrenheit, 29 and some change in centigrade, but it's actually pretty dry, just 15%. So even though you move to the right here, temperature is increasing, you are moving down because the humidity is so low. And that means you're actually decreasing the enthalpy. So now the enthalpy outside is actually only 24 or 25 and that's actually less than what you're having inside. And that means it makes more sense energy-wise to use the hot outdoors air even though the temperature is higher. And that's just because the humidity is so much lower. Okay, we've seen several different parameters here: relative humidity, dew point, wet bulb, enthalpy. All of these can find their different uses in an HVAC system. So how do you actually get these different parameters? The good thing is that if you know one of these humidity parameters and the ambient temperature, all of the others can be actually calculated. So one way to do that is actually plugging in the formulas for converting that into your controller. There are formulas for that we can provide also in a document. Another way to do, let's say, set point conversions or such things is to use a free online conversion utility that we are offering. That's actually on next page view of what you can do with that. But crucially, if you're doing actual control, quite many modern humidity transmitters can provide you also with other humidity parameters, not just relative humidity. And I've put in a picture here of one of our own humidity transmitters. This is the Vaisala HMD62 duct transmitter. And here you can see actually a dip switch bank, which allows you to very easily select not only relative humidity, but dew point, wet bulb, and enthalpy, and a few others even. So very easy, just need a screwdriver and you can switch humidity parameters in your transmitter. Okay, the humidity converter, you can see the address here where you can access it, and it works on both PC and mobile browsers. Actually even works offline if you're just saving the link on your mobile phone or tablet homepage. So then that means the actual code will be stored in the cache of your browser in your mobile device. So, okay, choice of many different languages, and you can see here one example, 20% RH, and it's converted into quite a few different humidity parameters, including all of those that we discussed today. There's enthalpy, wet bulb, and dew point temperature are all there. So pretty easy for deciding on, let's say, set points or such. All right, we're nearing the end of the presentation. As a conclusion, parameter-wise, if you're mainly interested just in human comfort, and usually relative humidity is a good choice. If you're trying to achieve very tight control for both temperature and humidity, probably you should think about dew point as a control parameter. For controlling cooling towers and to achieve free cooling, wet bulb is usually the control parameter of choice. But then if you're trying to really optimize your use of outside air and deciding whether to recondition return air or take in more or less outside air, then actually enthalpy is the right parameter that will tell you directly what to do. Okay, this was the end of my presentation. Thank you for joining us today, and let's see